Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. President Obama is revamping American nuclear weapons strategy to narrow the conditions under which the United States would use nuclear weapons. The president released details of his strategy called the Nuclear Posture Review before signing a new arms control agreement with Russia on Thursday and before hosting world leaders for a nuclear security summit next week. Joining us from Washington is Frank Gaffney, president of the Center for Security Policy, columnist for the Washington Times, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy in the Reagan administration. Welcome back to Newsmax TV, Frank.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
All right, there are two parts to this one. One being the Nuclear Posture Review, or Obama's new strategy. The other being the START treaty with Russia. Let's talk about the Nuclear Posture Review first. The new strategy renounces the development of any new nuclear weapons and commits the U.S. to not use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states in compliance with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, even if they attack the U.S. Is this a good idea?
Well, actually, both the new Nuclear Posture Review and the START Treaty reflect the president's overarching ambition, something that's been a fixation of his, I think it's fair to say, going back to 1983, when he was a young radical at Columbia University, and that is with the idea of disarming the world, he says, but as a practical matter, the only country he can disarm is the United States. And I think both of these are steps in that direction. As you mentioned, with respect to the Nuclear Posture Review, or NPR, he's foreclosing any modernization of our nuclear deterrent. At the same time as he's telling us that, we're going to have one for the foreseeable future because this world without nuclear weapons is a long-term goal, he's saying we're not going to modernize our forces. The practical effect of the president's decision not to modernize our nuclear deterrent is to condemn it to obsolescence and ultimately to the disarmament of the United States.
Frank, can Congress do anything to stop the president from adopting this new policy?
Well, the Congress could, in theory, reject the decisions that he's taking on the use of nuclear weapons, on the modernization of our nuclear arsenal, on the ratification of the START treaty. They have considerable latitude. Whether under a Democratic-controlled Congress, dominated by leftists, frankly, who probably see more or less along the same lines as the president on the virtues of nuclear disarmament, it's not clear that's going to happen. But I think there's going to be, my hope is at the very least, a response from the American people to some of these very risky ideas. The triumph of a notion of an ideological ambition that I think most people are going to defy common sense and certainly are not prudent in a world in which countries like North Korea and Iran and China and Russia are beavering away at nuclear threats and perhaps other capabilities as well in a way that will be very dangerous to us in the future.
Frank, I'd like to ask you a question about our response now to some of those countries that you just named. The president said he was going to make an exception for what he called outliers like Iran and North Korea because they violated or renounced the main treaty to halt nuclear proliferation. He wants to deter threats with a series of graded options combining old and new conventional weapons. Is that enough to protect us against rogue regimes and terrorist organizations?
I don't know. I guess he's going to say, well, let's see. My view of this is that deterrence is basically an insurance policy. And I'd rather be overinsured when you're dealing with countries like North Korea, which is in the throes of a succession crisis. Some people think that the end of that regime may be at hand. And whether we can prevent that kind of regime from utilizing nuclear capabilities it has remains to be seen. But I'd like to have more insurance, both of the offensive nuclear kind and missile defenses, than this president seems to think are needed. The American people are being confronted with a president who believes that he can take considerable risks with their safety and security I think they probably won't see it that way, and I hope they'll let their elected representatives know they don't.
All right. It's been reported that Secretary of Defense Gates opposed Obama's new policy. Did you hear that as well?
Well, we know for sure that last administration, when he was also the Secretary of Defense, he spoke very vociferously about the necessity of modernizing our nuclear forces. I understand that that was his position. In fact, the New York Times reports today that it took 150 meetings, not all of which involved him, of course, but involved, I'm sure, his subordinates, to basically wear them down to the point where the Defense Department apparently reluctantly went along with this idea. But look, anybody in a position of real responsibility who appreciates that it is and will remain vital to the security of the United States to have a credible, safe, reliable nuclear deterrent will tell you you need to modernize the ones we have because they're increasingly not safe, increasingly not reliable, and certainly ever less effective.
Frank, the president also said he is now convinced the course Iran is on right now will provide them with nuclear weapons capabilities. Does it alarm you that the Obama administration isn't taking a more aggressive approach with Iran?
Well, it alarms me that at the very moment the president is acknowledging that he is essentially sort of just going to get used to it, that one of the most dangerous countries on the planet, namely the Islamic Republic of Iran, as he likes to call them, is getting nuclear weapons. As he is saying, we're going to permit the increasing devaluation, in fact, disarmament of this country. Again, I just think the juxtaposition of these two realities further raises questions about President Obama's judgment and his faithful execution of his constitutional responsibilities for the common defense.
Let's talk about the New START Accord with Russia, which would make cuts in both U.S. and Russian nuclear arsenals, limiting each side to 1550 deployed warheads. Do you feel that's more than enough to preserve our defense? Again,
I don't know what the right number is, and I'm very leery of people who tell you they do know what the right number is. Here are some of the relevant facts. The Russians are busily modernizing their forces. They may have fewer numbers, but they're going to have very modern nuclear weapons. Communist China is busily expanding both the number and the quality of the nuclear weapons in its inventory. At the same time, other countries, indeed every other nuclear power, is modernizing its nuclear arsenal. Some of them are friends of ours, some of them are not necessarily. Then there's the rogue states, the North Koreas and the Irans. When you put all this together, I'm not sure whether it is advisable for the United States to have fewer nuclear weapons than it has had, but it is catastrophic not to have whatever number we wind up with be as modern, as safe, and as reliable as we know how to make them. And President Obama has explicitly foreclosed that option.
What is the value of this treaty, and will it give the Russians the advantage?
This treaty has advantages for the Russians, to be sure. The number of nuclear weapons that they are going to have to cut, I think, is roughly consistent with what they plan to do all along. They will force us down to their levels. Another feature that is, as I say, worrying to me is the Russians will have locked in effectively the modernization of their forces. They will also be able to continue to expand their forces should they choose to do so, and they've already served notice that they think the language in this treaty with respect to missile defenses gives them the opportunity to simply bug out when it suits their purposes if they think our missile defenses have jeopardized their arsenal. So the advantages, I think, are real to the Russians. They could become considerably greater if they do decide to exercise the option to withdraw because we put missile defenses in place. And then there's a whole class of weapons of which they have thousands, unmatched by us, called tactical nuclear weapons that aren't counted in this treaty at all. Some of them are off the coast of the United States today, pointing weapons the size of the weapon that devastated Hiroshima at our cities. And they don't count at all.
Frank, a previous New York Times story reported that Obama wants to eliminate all tactical nuclear warheads from Europe. Are you hearing that as well?
Well, this is in the article in the New York Times, of course, and whether it's true or not remains to be seen. It is certainly consistent with President Obama's agenda of denuclearizing the United States, and I fear leaving the kind of extended deterrence that we have heretofore provided our allies, principally, but not exclusively, principally in the form of these tangible nuclear defenses on their territories, that I think will cause us problems with our allies and will embolden our enemies.
Now, as it relates to arms control, President Reagan said, "Trust but verify." Can we trust Putin's Russia? And does this treaty do enough to verify?
Well, I must tell you, having worked for President Reagan, I cringed every time he used that expression, because I think when it comes to the Soviet Union or its current manifestation, which is Vladimir Putin, you can't trust. Verifying is something that's important, but this treaty doesn't begin to provide the tools whereby we could verify fully the terms of the treaty, let alone have a more comprehensive understanding of what it is the Russians are doing with their nuclear programs. For example, the tactical nuclear weapons that we just talked about. If you don't even know what they've got, let alone what they're doing with respect to modernization of them or deployment of them, you're going to be very poorly served by the illusion that a treaty is giving you some kind of verification and thereby insights into those capabilities.
Now, Ronald Reagan had stated that his ultimate goal was the elimination of nuclear weapons, but he was also for a very safe and secure America. What do you think he would say about Obama's policies?
Well, it's a very good question. Again, having worked for him in the nuclear weapons policy business, I can tell you that President Reagan was committed to assuring the effectiveness of our nuclear deterrent. Most of the nuclear weapons that we have still in the inventory today were bought and deployed during his time in office. I think he would be appalled by what's going on today, and probably most appalled, frankly, by those who are using his sentiments about nuclear weapons to justify this reckless and ill-advised denuclearization of the United States that's going on under the Obama administration today.
Frank, last question. The president took an oath to preserve and protect this nation. If the president faced a crisis, do you think he would use nukes?
I believe that any president would be very, very reluctant to use nuclear weapons. This president, by virtue of everything that he has said and done to date, I think would be exceedingly unlikely to do it. And here's the rub. Most of our enemies, and we do have enemies in this world, probably have figured that out as well and may be emboldened by it. And secondly, even if he is persuaded that the circumstances required the use of nuclear weapons for the safety and security of the American people, and even if he, President Obama, were willing to use them then, if this present practice persists of allowing our nuclear deterrent to atrophy, it's not clear they'll work when they should. And that, I'm afraid, would be a very, very dark day for America.
All right, Frank Gaffney, president of the Center for Security Policy in Washington, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Pleasure's mine. Thank you.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.
Sarah Palin's new book, Going Rogue in American Life, will be released on November 17th. You can be among the first to get your copy. Check out our incredible free offer for Sarah's new book. Just go to Newsmax.com and click on the top banner for this great offer. Act today.